Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
Yeah, so now we are finally at the birth of Isaac. And goodness, it feels like we've been at this for months now with Abraham. And there have been the promises of him being a great nation and him eventually having children and him having Ishmael because he felt pressured into it and he felt like he wasn't going to have children with Sarah, and then the conflict there, and then Sodom and Gomorrah and God showing up. And now we're finally here. And it feels like a lot of buildup. So what's the payoff?
A little baby.
Starting in Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac, or Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So that seems to be the payoff. God shows up, but unlike the previous chapter, I think it was chapter 18 when God showed up with the two men before Sodom and talked. And there, we get to see the whole conversation. Here we're just told God shows up.
There's two things I find really funny here as a birth worker. So the first thing that I find really funny here is that the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. So there's this thing in labor where, like in the movies, you did this to me. God did this to Sarah. But also this verse 6 where Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. I think it's so funny because I see that even now happening. There's this thing trending with this 72-year-old woman that got pregnant, like miraculously, randomly. And people are comparing her to Sarah and saying, well, if God could do it for Sarah, God could do it for anyone. And I think it's funny because we're still laughing about this thousands of years later. We're still, hey, if God wills it, it's unbelievable.
But yeah, this is the point where he's born. But it doesn't seem to be something with an enormous amount of fanfare. Like you would think with God showing up, this is a really big moment, and it is, but this seems more like a point of emotional release. God's involvement here is a focal point, but it's not the focal point. There's not this big unfolding of the story where God shows up and has a big conversation with them and tells them, you know what, you guys should have trusted me more.
This is a piece of the covenant, but this is not the fulfillment of the covenant. That in the next chapter, Isaac's birth is a great part of their story, and they've long awaited him. And yet, Isaac being born is not the fulfillment of the covenant.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because it seems like all of the chapters that we've done of Abraham up until now, it was leading to the birth of Isaac. But that is not the case with the biblical text here. There's honestly very little to go off of for the birth of Isaac. Like, it's not very large. It's not super energetic. We laugh. His name means laughter. Ha ha.
It seems like a wave of relief. It seems more like this is something that they've been promised, and they knew in their minds that it was supposed to be true. But the day finally comes, and they're just like, who would have thought? It seems like they're laughing and crying at the same time. It seems like it's an emotional release for the both of them, and they're just happy. Now, it doesn't stay that way. Things get complicated pretty quickly, but for at least this time, everything seems good. They all seem happy.
It does seem like closure to the laughter of disbelief because now they have the baby and now they're just laughing as a fulfillment of that. But laughter is a big theme in this chapter because then Sarah sees Ishmael laughing, and we can get into why he was laughing and how old he might have been. But in this one moment, Sarah's laughing, remembering her doubt when she was told she would have Isaac. And then the next minute she's like seeing someone else laugh and saying, nope, get out. It goes from being like really wholesome to being mean sounding, like depending on how you interpret it.
Yeah, so Genesis chapter 21, verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, referring to Isaac. And Abraham made a feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So yeah, this, again, it seems like Hagar's treated unfairly. It's like Ishmael is laughing, and this is somehow Hagar's fault. And yeah, Ishmael's young.
Here's the thing, okay? Like, this chapter does infantilize Ishmael a little bit. It makes it sound like Hagar carried him on her hip out of the camp. No, he was 17 years old at this point. For all intents and purposes, he was almost a full-grown man.
More or less. Still a youth in a sense. But yes, he's not a child.
It's not like an 8-year-old kid who's like, "I'm going to steal your lollipop." It's like a teenager who could easily brawl and do great harm.
Yeah, and this particular story is treated very differently depending on which Jewish tradition you go with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cody?
Yeah, a lot of Jewish tradition doesn't have great things to say about Ishmael at all. And this is completely diverging from the biblical text. I don't see any of this in the text at all, in the Bible in general. But one of the common things for this is when Ishmael is caught laughing, some interpretations have it as mockery, like he was mocking Isaac, the 3 or 4 year old at the time, like being weaned. He'd have been around 3 or 4.
Between 2 to 5.
Some other interpretations have that Ishmael was shooting arrows at Isaac, which, again, nowhere in biblical text at all.
Wild donkey of a man, you get what you get.
Yeah, and later on in text, you hear about Ishmael getting a bow, but that's after he's exiled out of the camp of Abraham. So a lot of this doesn't really add up biblically in Jewish tradition and seems to be going more towards the Jewish disdain for what is spawned out of Ishmael.
It's the preservation of Abraham and Sarah's reputation.
And it seems like there are different degrees of treatment for Ishmael. There's the biblical text, which just shows him as laughing. And I should have looked up the actual Hebrew word for the laughter here.
It's metzahek, which means to laugh or mock, depending on context. The same word was used when Abraham laughed at God's promise in Genesis 17, but it was also used with joyful play when Isaac was playing with Rebekah in Genesis 26:8. Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of mocking her with the same word, and the Israelites rose up to play during the golden calf incident in Exodus 32 with the same word.
So, yeah, the word laugh here could mean mock, and I actually would argue it probably does. And the reason I would argue that is because Paul seems to think that there was a rocky relationship between Ishmael and Isaac.
That's Galatians 4:29 if you need it.
That's Galatians chapter 4, verses 28 through 29. "Now you, my brothers and sisters, are children of the promise, like Isaac. But just as at that time the child who was born according to the flesh persecuted the child who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also." And the child born according to the flesh, he says earlier in this chapter in Galatians, is Hagar giving birth to Ishmael. So Paul, at the very least, seems to be leaning into the interpretation that this is a mocking laugh. If he's pulling purely from Scripture, and most likely he isn't purely pulling from Scripture, he is probably also pulling from some traditions as well. But even with the limited amount that we're pointed back into this time in Genesis in the New Testament, we don't get that it's a horrible relationship. That Ishmael is just a terrible, awful child that's causing all sorts of havoc. There are other traditions that talk about how Ishmael and Hagar are pagan worshiping, just outright in the middle of the camp, and Abraham is angry about that, and then God has to calm him down and send them out of the camp, where that's clearly not what's being said in the text. Abraham is clearly conflicted about what to do about his son, because this is his son, and this is also technically one of his other wives. He's conflicted about what to do with them. He feels responsible. And then God has to come and say, it's okay. Listen to what Sarah's saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Abraham in this text is mad at Ishmael. He seems displeased that he's having to send out one of his sons. This is still one of his sons. He still has an attachment to Ishmael, and he is not happy about sending Ishmael out.
I have so many questions about this text because we've talked in the past about the age of accountability and all of that. But if Abraham loved his son, Ishmael, but his son was like almost an adult, was this God's way of saying he's old enough to not need your care anymore and he needs to go out and become the man that I've declared he's going to be to Hagar? Is this the fulfillment of what God promised to Hagar? What is the point of sending him away? Is it just that it's Isaac's turn to be the son? Why does he need to leave?
I mean, you have the dual covenants here almost, the one with Hagar and the one with Abraham. And you know how Lot and Abraham had to split. I don't think Ishmael could thrive into his own nation if he was inside of another one. So I do think this is like the coming of age for Ishmael and how he starts the covenant promise of that nation, because I don't think they could do it together. All focus would have been on Isaac. Like from the clan of Abraham, like everything would point to Isaac because he's the promised son. He's the chosen one. That would be the focus. So Ishmael would always be secondary to that in the direct line.
And we've also seen how damaging this kind of relationship can be, not necessarily with Isaac and Ishmael, because we're not given that opportunity to see it. However, we do see it with Jacob and Esau, because Jacob is the child of the covenant. He is the one who gets the birthright. He is the one who, though is younger, the older will serve the younger. Esau I have rejected.
We have an almost 14-year-old and a 4-year-old. We get it. In a certain level of sibling rivalry there and jealousy because the little ones get the more attention.
Well, and this has another layer because ancient Near East, like even until more modern times, like the oldest would always get the inheritance. Ishmael would technically have claim to the inheritance from Abraham if there wasn't this covenant with God. And that in the Jacob and Esau story of the eldest is the one who's supposed to get the blessing, supposed to have the birthright, but God has other plans. So you see that kind of mirrored here as well. And it's where Jewish tradition is, there's nothing biblically supporting it, but interesting because there's a lot of interaction in Jewish tradition that has Ishmael and Isaac still interacting even after this point. And when they're expelled from camp, I don't really think that they're super far apart. They never see each other again, because later in, I think, 25, you read about how they come back together to bury Abraham. So they're still in contact to some extent, and Jewish tradition furthers that, saying, you know, there's all these interactions between Isaac and Ishmael, and like circumcision and all of that comes in. Ishmael's, oh, my circumcision was better because I was old enough to protest. When I was circumcised, it means more. And Isaac's like, I would have done the same thing, but Ishmael's, you were only 8, you couldn't protest. Mine's better.
It is also interesting to note that Abraham circumcises Isaac on the 8th day, like he's supposed to. And I think this actually plays into what happens in the next chapter, because you are basically dedicating the child to God when you circumcise the child. This is his first and only child that Abraham has that he has to circumcise on the 8th day, dedicating him to the Lord. Now, yes, this is something they have to do for all children, but because this is so early on in the process, this is where God is testing that dedication, where he has basically, through this act of circumcision, offered Isaac up to God. And so God says, okay, do you really believe he's mine? But we'll get to that next week. But it is really interesting how often there's this motif of the younger brother or the younger child getting the blessing, because that seems to happen a lot. It's Jacob and Esau, but then it's also like Solomon is one of the youngest of...
And David, too.
Yeah, David himself. He's the youngest of his brothers. Like, how often is it that the younger ends up getting the blessing?
I think this is unique to biblical text because the younger was not supposed to, but that happens all throughout Bible. Like you have Esau and Jacob, you have Joseph, you have David, like you have all of these biblical characters whose God's, it's my choice, not mankind's choice. Like it was always the eldest was the inheritance, but now, no, it's, I see the heart of man. Like I get to choose who I want to choose. And that sounds very Calvinist, but it is not. So I don't know the connection, but it just, they'll consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both man and beast is mine. The idea that the firstborn is consecrated to God in the sense, and there's a lot of Numbers, Leviticus, Exodus, all talk about the firstborn are mine.
Yeah, it is interesting because God establishes this rule, but then for the line that leads to Jesus, he always says, okay, that's great, but I'm not going to choose from what's mine. I'm going to choose from something that could have no hope of ever being mine. It's the youngest. It's the one that seemingly is the furthest from me. That is what I will choose. And I think in many ways that's another miniature gospel message, that he's always choosing the least likely. Yeah, the thing that has the highest honor he turns aside and instead goes for the humblest and the smallest.
Maybe, but a lot of just taking into consideration what age I became a Christian at, like I was 25, and knowing how I felt in my life with trials that I faced, I still see Hagar and Ishmael as a kind of like underdog here. They didn't have the benefit of wealth and a big family to take care of them, and she was a vulnerable woman, and he was not a man at full maturity. They're sent off on this journey that frankly could have killed them without God's intervention. And to me, like that is an underdog story. And it's interesting that Isaac is this promised son in the lineage of the Messiah, but then Ishmael is credited with the Arab and Muslim religions.
It's clear that God still blessed Isaac, and God repeatedly says throughout multiple chapters that he is going to bless Isaac and make him a mighty nation because of Abraham.
But he says he's going to bless Ishmael too. It's just not a divine blessing. It's an earthly
Sorry, that's
blessing.
what I meant, Ishmael.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I keep saying the wrong names. My names are horrible. Yeah, I'm sorry. I misspoke.
Too many eyes.
Yeah. But he repeatedly says throughout multiple chapters that he's going to bless Ishmael and make him a mighty nation because of Abraham. You're right. He still is blessed. And there are multiple points where God takes pity on them both throughout multiple points in their life. And yet, once again, we see, as so often happens, because he is the result of mankind trying to make their own way, trying to solve problems they don't need to solve. The result of Ishmael and his line is not something that leads to the promise.
It's not fruitful for the Lord.
It's fruitful in a human sense. It's fruitful in a materialistic sense, but it's not fruitful to the Lord. You're right.
And it seems like through all of these stories, it seems like God is picking the least likely to succeed to show his power. He waits so long for Abraham here, and only God could make somebody have a baby this late in their lives. He chooses David out of all his other brothers, who described as small compared to the rest of his family.
Little redhead.
Mm-hmm.
And he chooses him to do it and not one of the stronger ones. So it's almost like going back to that story of the kings with Abraham, where Abraham rejects everybody's gifts, saying, I don't want any part of that because I don't want you to come back and say, I was successful because you blessed me. God is doing, I think, something similar here where I can take whatever I want and make it the greatest thing ever. No matter the situation, I can still make it great.
So Hagar's kicked out. Ishmael with her. They're given bread and water and told to hit the trail.
Yep, Genesis chapter 21, verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And she sat opposite him, lifted her voice, and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Lift up the boy and hold him fast in your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
See, this is so interesting because one, the angel of God calls her by name, but then also God was with him. Like he grew up and knew the Lord, but did not follow the Lord because he's credited with the Muslim religion.
He's credited with being, he's in many ways the father of the faith, just like Isaac is one of the founders of the Jewish faith. So, yeah.
Like they make these promises that for Abraham inspire loyalty and forbearance, but then with Ishmael and Hagar, you don't see that. You actually see Hagar taking this wife from the land of Egypt, which is where she comes from, where all of her beliefs originally came from. That's not a great thing. She's seen these miracles worked for Abraham. Why is she not being loyal to that? Is it because she knows that's not for her? Does she just give up?
And again, I think this goes to God proving why he chooses the people that he does. And this, again, going between Saul and David. Saul is the king that the people of Israel choose. Samuel is the last of the judges, and all the people come to him and say, give unto us a king, just like all the other nations have. And God says, no, it's okay. Give it to them because they're rejecting me as their king. Saul is the king that they want. And ultimately, God does choose him, but he only chooses him because this is what the people want. And so he gives them the king that they want to choose, a really tall man who's really strong and capable of fighting. And then he turns out to be a bust. Hagar is...
Spoiler alert.
Yes, we'll get there eventually in 5 years. But Hagar is the woman that Abraham chose to try to solve a problem that he thought he had. He was like, I'm going to be the father of a great nation. Okay, I guess I have to make this happen on my own. And rather than wait for God, he took the matter into his own hands. And this is the result. This is why God chose Sarah and not Hagar. And it does seem really unfair. If we were going to make a modern movie on this, then Sarah would have been the one that was thrown out ages ago. Because she seems awful.
Everybody would have left this movie and been like 0 stars.
Yeah.
Sarah's beauty does not make up for her terrible personality.
No. But that's the reality. Sarah, as many mistakes as she makes, she still follows Abraham.
I think we have to divorce this idea that fair is our interpretation of fair. Like when God makes a covenant, God enforces the covenant and does what it takes to fulfill the covenant. And if that means crappy people get blessed, sometimes that's what happens. And it's an unfortunate truth, but it's to fulfill God's promise or God's word, not to do what we think is fair and right based on personality favoritism.
Yeah, I think we lose the idea of this is not the goal. Like God has made a covenant with these people, but this is not the fulfilling of the true covenant. Jesus is that fulfillment. It's not these people are being blessed. They're just the vessels being used by God to promote the true Messiah, the actual fulfillment of the covenant, not they're blessed because of Jesus. There's
nothing they did to deserve or earn the blessing that God is willing to give them here. They were just average people from average places involved with average things. They didn't stand out. There's nothing in the Bible that says Abraham was a stand-up guy and God was like, you deserve to have a baby. And there's none of that. What you get is flawed people living lives that are pretty relatable and flawed. And God being like, I'm going to do this through you for the future of humanity. It's not because you're glorious. It's not because you're good. It's not because you're deserving. It's not because you did anything right. It's because I said so, because I know everybody else needs this too.
What's also interesting here is that God does, like you said before, Gina, God doesn't abandon Hagar and he doesn't abandon Ishmael. He stays with them and he reaches out to them multiple times. And yet eventually the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, turn their back on God. They become pagans themselves. And it seems like they turn pagan pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And that may be in part because Hagar decides to go back to her old homeland and try to get a wife for her son there.
It's weird because Abraham didn't play a part in that. And realistically, he would have if they had stayed close. It's almost a spiteful tactic, or like a self-reliant tactic on Hagar's part to say, this is what I know, so this is what you get. Those people didn't like me.
And while righteousness ultimately does come from God, while justification comes from God, there is something to be said for the people that God chooses, where they say yes. Abraham said yes. Sarah, for all her faults, still says yes. Hagar says no. And Ishmael says no. And they go their own way, even though God stays with them and gives them every reason to say yes. I think this also goes to, I know it's a slight tangent, but there are people who ask the question, why doesn't God reveal himself to everybody? Just all the time. Why does he give no one any excuse? And one, I would argue that in many ways he does reveal himself to everybody. But as far as why he doesn't supernaturally reveal himself, he revealed himself to Hagar and Ishmael, and they still go their own way. And that makes their decision even worse. Because at that point, God has revealed himself to them, and they are rejecting him with greater knowledge than if he never had.
God's interaction in the Old Testament is different than the New Testament is different than now. There's 3 distinct periods where God involves himself with people's lives in unique ways. And I think it's a trap. We get stuck in this. Why did Abraham get to speak with God directly? Why did he get to share a meal with Jesus? Why did Moses? Why did Paul? We're not them. We're in a different time, and it's really hard to compare our walk with theirs. There are similarities, there are struggles that they faced that are relatable, but ultimately, God doesn't interact with us now the way that he did back then. It's not really a fair comparison.
And sometimes he does. You can hear stories about people who say that God reached out to them audibly, or they visibly saw something, or there was an intervention supernaturally, and so they know that God is real.
And I have had those, but
Sure.
It's different than Cody being in the house and me being in the front yard and me overhearing Jesus, who's there in the flesh, telling Cody that I'm going to have a baby, and me laughing and then walking in and getting called on it. It's usually a very individual, unique experience that other people can attest to because something was one way and it changes, and that's miraculous. But it's not a firsthand in the flesh experience that's able to be verified the same way that Jesus was walking with these people. Jesus was with these angels and they were visible and the whole town was following them around. You don't have that today.
But even, let's say for the sake of argument that Jesus did physically show up to your door and knock on it and he say, "Hi, I'm Jesus."
It wouldn't be Jesus because the rapture isn't happening.
Sure.
We have biblical information to tell us how he's going to return. If someone knocks on my door and says that, I'm not going to believe them.
Sure, but sake of argument, let's say that Jesus literally does that. Let's say that Jesus shows up, knocks on your door, or let's say Michael or an angel. An angel shows up, if we're that offended by Jesus showing up before the rapture, and say, "Hi, I'm supernaturally letting you know God's real and everything you believe is real." God doesn't do that just so that, like you read earlier, Gina, even angels know that God exists and they shudder. The demons know and shudder. What is the point of simply knowing? Again, Saul knew and he wasn't obedient. You can be obedient without certainty. You just have to know what you're supposed to do. And as Jesus also says, blessed are those who have not yet seen and yet still believe. The belief there means trust. And how do you show trust? By obedience. So that's ultimately, I think, why. Jesus showing up physically or not is not the point. The point is, would you say yes? Do you now say yes to whatever it is you're told to do? And if the answer is no, then why would you want him to show up and tell you?
I don't think that's being as empathetic to a lot of agnostic people today, though, because there is this sense, and I've been there myself, of why did they get this physical representation of God? If I had that, at that point, you have no doubt that God is real. Everybody today can't have that experience. There is always going to be a percentage that God is not real in people's lives because they haven't witnessed the physical representation of God. And it's the whole, and we've covered it way back in the argument from reasonable non-belief. There is some merit to that. Ultimately, it doesn't fulfill anything, but there is some merit to that.
I see that. I see what you're saying. And I personally believe that if any Christian were to say that there's not a single piece of them that has these questions, like you just mentioned, they're lying. We all have to go through the spiritual development of proving to ourselves that God exists. The 5 core assumptions at the very beginning of when we started all of this. And you have to wrestle with those questions to get to an answer to build your faith. I think anybody who says they've never questioned that is lying.
And still, it's almost like a process in my own mind. I have to go through the cosmological argument in my head. I have to go back through the fine tuning. And there is no reasonable explanation to life as it is now without God. And I have to be okay with that little bit of doubt. Even Paul mentions that if the resurrection didn't happen, the Christians are the most to be pitied. I don't think Paul doubted anything, but he's still throwing that out there as this explanation of, if this didn't happen, we're all stupid, but we're the most to be pitied right now. And one of the questions that I would like to ask in this scenario is, would have Ishmael fallen away if he wasn't anathematized from
the family?
The family. Is the excommunication from the tribe what is his downfall?
I would say no. In part, I think this goes into your question, Gina, about the infantilization Ishmael. Mm-hmm. He's fairly old at this point, and yet he seems almost helpless and useless. And we see that as he grows up, he becomes a fairly wild man. And there are bits and pieces that we see throughout the Bible. You know, we read the passage in Galatians about the persecution of Isaac by Ishmael. He seems to be a bit of a troublesome kid from the beginning. Not that he's evil or anything, not that he's irredeemable, but that he seems to be on a dark path from the start. And when he's let out into the open, he grows into that. He becomes the wild man who's an archer.
I don't see that in the Bible, though. I think this is Paul's second temple background coming out. He's reading the Jewish tradition that we are. Like, are we supposed to hold that with the same weight?
Not the entirety of it, but it's the same. We can't look at something like Jude and see him quoting Enoch. Look at that and say, well, that's not a mistake. Obviously, that's correct. And then also look at Paul talking about Ishmael and saying, that's a mistake. He's obviously leaning too much on Second Temple literature. That's not right. I think that you can still make the argument based on what we're given in these passages. We see the mocking laughter, assuming you interpret as mocking laughter. And I think that's the help that the traditions give us. Not leaning all the way into them, but when you look at some of these older traditions, they do still point out the fact that it seems like it's mocking, and that Ishmael may have been a troublesome youth and was on a darker path. Now, I don't think it goes as bad or as dark. I don't think he was idol worshiping.
He didn't join a gang and get a motorcycle and a tattoo.
But at the same time, his descendants, are they righteous people?
No. The same argument could be made for Israel. Israel constantly falls away, but if God wasn't pulling them back, they would be obliterated.
Where's the return of the Ishmaelites?
Where's God pulling them back in that sense? The Ishmaelites were not the representation of God, so there was no pulling back.
Again, it's tough because, like the Midianites, there was a pulling back there. Jethro, high priest of Midian, seems to be a guy who fears God. So while we don't have the full history of God's interaction with every tribe in the ancient world, I don't think it's fair to say that God just purely chose Abraham and didn't reach out to anybody else, because we see the Midianites do still worship God. And there's also Michael or Melchizedek in Jerusalem. So
Michael works.
Yeah, Michael or Melchizedek. I lean pretty heavily on that. I just want to be as fair as possible.
No, and you do get, like, Nineveh is another one. God pulls them back. So there is some there. I just don't see this terrible representation of Ishmael. Like, you have one word that could mean mocking, but could mean laughter too.
Like,
and
playful laughter.
And that's really the only derogatory until you get to Paul in the New Testament of Ishmael.
Also, yes, there is some leaning into extra biblical interpretation, but that's also what we lean into in order to get Michael as Melchizedek. It's not purely explicitly laid out in the text. You have to go to the scroll of Melchizedek and the war scroll and a few other things to get that interpretation. Yes, we do have to be careful with the extra biblical accounts that we get. However, Paul is also leaning on those accounts, so we have New Testament attestation to it.
But you know that Ishmael doesn't feel too terribly bad about his dad because he goes to his funeral. So if I were mad at somebody and hated them to the point of not wanting them in my life, I wouldn't show up to their funeral. I don't know.
And there's no conflict between Isaac and Ishmael there either. You don't see like this conflict later on in life.
Like
Ishmael pretty much disappears.
He could have made an issue of inheritance. He could have said, I'm the firstborn, dad's dead, I want my inheritance.
Yeah, but also in 2 generations, they become slave traders.
Yeah.
Like they literally buy Jacob and sell him in Egypt. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows, even according to the history of the
Joseph's brothers are the ones who sold them.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
So
I'm
they
aware of
became
that.
slave traders as well. But
Yeah, they sold, and even Jacob says, don't feel bad about what you did because it was God's doing. God was still using Ishmael and Isaac, like their descendants.
I just think it's more neutral. Ishmael might have misbehaved around Isaac and been inappropriate or whatever, but ultimately Isaac was like 4 or 5 years old. Maybe he wouldn't have even been old enough to remember Ishmael's behavior. And then later, when Abraham passes away, they meet up and it's neutral. And maybe there is something to ill will or whatever, and the family for Ishmael gets derailed and goes and becomes slave traders and all of that, fine. But ultimately, I see this as a relatively neutral interaction.
I'm not trying to argue that Ishmael and Hagar immediately turn evil or anything. What I'm saying is that they drift further and further away from God. And it's the same thing with Lot. Lot is still considered to be a righteous man, and yet we've already made arguments he wanders to the east. He's making his own way. Hagar and Ishmael make their own way, and their descendants also go their own way. We don't see them wander back to God like we see in some cases with the Midianites or with Ruth, who, what was she? Moabite, yeah. So even the Moabites and have a complicated history too.
And I agree, but they were forced to make their own way. Is that my only argument is if, and tying that into like church, like if you excommunicate somebody from a church or your family, that can be their downfall. Is this the downfall of Ishmael because he was excommunicated?
The Bible still says that God was with them, so I would say no.
God was with them, but they were vulnerable. They were in the wilderness, and it was a vulnerable woman and a vulnerable child, according to the text.
Sure, but by the same stroke, Abraham and Sarah were made a promise a very long time ago, and it took decades and decades to fulfill. God was with them, but it probably didn't feel that way for them. And they also lie and do other things, but in the end, they still remain righteous. That label of righteousness is still never given to Hagar or to Ishmael. And there are even not a lot is said about Hagar in traditions that I was able to find, except for the fact that there's one passage in the Apocrypha. I can't remember if it was from Sirach or Tobit's, but it talks about how the descendants of Hagar sought wisdom but didn't find it.
It's just weird because Hagar cries out to God at the well, but doesn't. That's it. That's the only time. Was his response at that time not enough? Because she knew to cry out to him multiple times. There's multiple examples of this. And then there's such a far fall away from God.
So I think the question here, is it their fault? Is it our fault when we fall away from God, or is it God's fault? I'm not certain if we're putting it on God that Ishmael fell away. If there was a falling away, if there was indeed any kind of falling away, I don't think we can blame God for that.
I think for me, the point is just, you can know God and you can get an answer from God and have that not be good enough and be the reason you leave. And so we crave this interaction with God, but then when you actually get your answer and you're not satisfied, you're like, whatever, I'm going to do it my way anyway.
The reason why this is so impactful and why I'm much harder on the Jewish interpretations of this is because the superiority complex that Jewish folk need to have over Ishmael here, and how that influenced their writing on the subject, and how we know people are hurt or excommunicated by church leaders with nothing that they've done for themselves, and that completely ruins people's faith just because the interaction of that leader.
No, absolutely. This goes into, I think, really well, Abraham's reaction. He's not happy about any of this. And it is clear that this does need to happen because, as we see from future episodes that are similar to this, you can't have two sons together who are competing with one another for the blessing. And ultimately, they're given separate blessings, so there's no point. Why have them compete? And yet, ultimately, there always is this conflict between brothers. Every single time. We see it with Jacob and Esau. We see it with even Jacob's sons, like all of the sons of Jacob. And the fight with the youngest. So in order to avoid future conflict, it does seem like it was the right move. But it's not something that he's happy about. And tying this into excommunication from the church, yeah, absolutely. I think we can go too far in the opposite direction and say that throwing someone out, casting someone out is always bad or always wrong. Because this is even something that Paul talks about people who are living in sin, and a man sleeps with his father's wife and you're happy, you are proud. Why not cast this man out from among you? Now, that's not to say that's what happens here with Ishmael and Hagar. All that is to say that there are times where it's appropriate, and Abraham's not happy about it, he doesn't rejoice in it, and he doesn't consider himself or Sarah to be superior to these two. And I do agree, with so much of the tradition, there's a superiority complex, and there's this anger. There shouldn't be anger towards Ishmael and Hagar for this.
They were just a piece of a bigger picture here in God's plan.
The reason I'm so hard on the tradition here and not other places is because there's a conflict of interest. The Jewish writers here are inserting their dominance of the birthright, basically, inserting their race superiority here. And there's a conflict of interest in writing about Ishmael versus Michael as Melchizedek. There's not a conflict of interest.
Would you say that conflict is inherent in the Bible itself? Because
I don't see that in Moses's writings. No, I do not see the conflict there, but I also don't see any of the derogatory comments of Ishmael really in the biblical text. It's much later when Israel is established that these writings portraying Ishmael poorly are developed. Even Jubilees, earlier Second Temple stuff doesn't have as derogatory remarks. It's usually...
Not as, but I don't think we need to even go that far, because even with just what's written in the text, just Ishmael having a good time doesn't seem to be a reason to set Sarah off, because they've been together for a very long time. However, him laughing in a mocking way, mocking Isaac, does actually make a lot of sense. And if we don't want to say that, if we want to say that Sarah is 100% the bad guy here, then you also have to ask why it is that God says, listen to Sarah. So I think there is enough evidence here, and even including Paul's testimony on the fact, which, yes, could be biased, but if it's scripture, it could be biased, but also true. But even setting that aside and just going with exclusively what's written in the text, I think there's enough to say that there was some friction. Not an enormous amount, and not anything that you don't see in regular families anyway. But the responsibility here was a lot higher because God and the future are literally involved.
Yeah, but the friction in this text is between Sarah and Ishmael, not Ishmael and Isaac.
Seemingly. That, again, all goes down to whether or not you interpret the laughter as mocking. And if it is, then it implies that there's more there. But it would be nice if we were told a lot more just flat out. Again, this implies that there's context that people reading this should already know. And that's why I'm okay with leaning on some of the extra biblical accounts, the tradition, that says that it wasn't all paradise. But at the same time, it's the older stuff that's more charitable and portrays it more real.
Yeah. I do think it's notable in Genesis 16 where the angel's prophesying to Hagar about Ishmael says, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen, like he will butt up against his family in a negative way. We know just from this prophecy when he's little that Ishmael is going to be a little combative or confrontational and a little wild. So like that could just be his nature. And that's the way that he was brought up. And that was accepted because that's what was prophesied over him. And that's just the character of Ishmael. And we have to live with that.
Yeah. And there is ultimately, I think Cody's point is what caused that. If he had stayed with Abraham, would that have remained the same? And I think, again, there's enough in the Bible.
The heavenly people prophesying over him said that he would be wild and combative. We know that. Sorry.
Why?
I don't know. I'm being combative. I'm being like Ishmael. I have the spirit of Ishmael.
No, this is good.
The spirit of Jezebel?
Yeah.
Except even worse.
Because you're the worst idol worshiper.
Begone, foul
spirit. The spirit of Jezebel is bad because it's not just, yeah. Anyway.
So was there anything else you wanted to cover? Because I think we're getting a ways into this.
Yeah. So the last part is just Abraham and Abimelech made a treaty. So Genesis 21:22, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Basically, Abimelech's, don't mess with me again.
In so many ways. And he was being pretty nice and diplomatic about it.
Yeah, but he brought the commander of his army just to make the point.
Yeah, there was some conflict there for sure. There's all these sheep and oxen and different types of animals being brought, and Abimelech's, what the heck? Mm-hmm. Why are these here?
So then in 21:25, Abraham reproves Abimelech about a well of water that his servants had seized. Verse 26, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the lands of the Philistines.
There's a few things that stuck out here for me. One, the Genesis 21:31, the place will be called Beersheba, is constantly referenced for the documentary hypothesis, or JEDP. So like this idea that there's multiple authors of Genesis, and why they cite that is because it's called Beersheba, but we already heard about Beersheba before. Like, why is it referenced? And that's easily explained away by Moses. This text is not said to be authored by Abraham. This is to be authored by Moses, who lived much later than Abraham. So he would have known the different names or the name change. So easily explainable as the author of Moses, and why, I don't know why they use this one constantly, but that's one of them.
So you're saying Abraham didn't write his own story?
No, and the Bible doesn't claim that he did. The Torah is Moses.
The books of Moses, yeah.
No.
It just is Moses.
It's Moses.
He merged with it.
So why did he plant a tree? That seems like a very specific thing to do.
Yeah, it was weird to me too. It was common practice in the area to establish a divine presence. And you see this cool at the end after he plants the tree. He actually dedicates and calls to Lord, the everlasting God. And this is not a term commonly used in the Bible. Isaiah developed it a little bit. Daniel, the Arabic written Daniel, developed it a little bit. And then it pops up in some Second Temple literature, connecting to like the Ancient of Days mentality of from everlasting to everlasting is God.
So what's the relevance of that for this particular meeting between Abraham and Abimelech and the planting of a tree?
As far as the dedication?
As far as the use of the everlasting to everlasting, the everlasting God. Why would he invoke that name specifically after this meeting?
It's structured really weird. So like it's structured El Olam, and the common god, or one of the common gods in that area, was El. That was the god on high, and Ur, and some different Canaanite religions as well. So he is saying Yahweh, so Lord, the Lord in this text is Yahweh, then El Olam. So Yahweh is the God everlasting, God forever. So
you
he's
have
saying
it here as the one to whom belongs the time before time.
Oh, that's actually one Enoch.
Oh.
Is the point of the tree then to be that it's something that will bear witness to their covenant long after they're both dead?
So a tamarisk tree is not a terebinth tree, so it's not the same as the great trees of Mamre.
Oh, dear.
We don't hear about Abraham collecting the seed pods from the tree and carrying them with him because that's where he built his altar to the Lord. No, that's not what it is. A tamarisk tree is a small to medium-sized tree or shrub with feathery branches, also known as a salt cedar, and grows near riverbanks like sand. The terebinth tree is much larger and can live a very long time. And another cool thing about the terebinth is if you cut it down, another one will grow out of the stump.
So cool.
So yeah, it seems the point of the tree is that it's meant to bear witness and that it's going to be a sign of the covenant long after they're both dead.
He probably planted that kind because that's what was already there.
Yeah, probably. It would have been a lot cooler if it was one of the trees from Mamre.
He brought his tree with him.
It's his mascot, the tree of Abraham.
Father Abraham had many trees.
He really didn't technically have many sons.
He had a lot of great grandkids, but...
So do we all.
Details, Gina.
2 children is not that plentiful. Anyway, speaking of hobbies, gardening, languages. One of the cool things that helped us with this episode is Biblingo. So I think we should probably plug that here at the very end since we missed out before.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea at the end of everything. Yeah, we've actually reached out to this program called Biblingo, this kind of online language service that teaches you the different languages in the Bible. And we reached out to them. They didn't reach out to us, but we wanted to partner with them because Cody had referred me to it and I started using it, and it's very handy. It's a really great tool. It's very similar to a service like Duolingo that teaches you very slowly and organically how to speak other languages, but this is specifically geared towards teaching you biblical languages. And as we started going through the Old Testament, we found it to be immeasurably helpful to really know even just a tiny bit about the original language. And we constantly refer to the original language because it really is important to get that initial understanding, that the original text and what it was meant to mean. And you have to get that through the original language.
You also get good pronunciation.
Oh, yes.
For those difficult words.
Yeah. Yes, I didn't know that Isaac was actually Isaac.
But you get a richer understanding when you have the name and you have the words said correctly.
Yeah, it'll blow your mind because Abram's not really, it's Abram.
Abram. Yeah, it's a V. Yeah. We put a B in there for some reason.
Yeah. I loved the way Albert pronounced all the names. Anyway, Biblingo is really passionate about biblical literacy, and that's also something we are very passionate about. So if you would like to learn more about Biblingo, you can go to biblingo.org. You can download their app, and our listeners get a good discount. It is Logic of God 10 for 10% off. Also, we are giving away one of their higher level memberships for 1 year free a month. So that is a $288 value, free to you if you sign up for our giveaways online.
We also have a few other partners that we've managed to find, and if you want to know more about them, and as more of that develops, if you go to our website, thelogicofgod.com, and you click on the Partners tab, we have a few different partners and affiliates there with links to them and more information about them. So please go and check that out.
Yes.
Yeah, and these are ones that we have pursued ourselves or personally use. We will never partner with people that we don't personally believe in.
Yeah, no, you're not going to get like iced tea advertisements in the middle of our episodes.
Or Harry's razors.
Yeah, no, one thing about having these affiliates, like we really do take seriously apologetics and deepening the faith and getting people off of the baby formula of a sermon on Sunday and really into the meat of things. And one of the tools that we use regularly is Logos. Another is Biblingo. Biblical Backgrounds is another one that we love, and they have all of the maps and ancient geography. We want you to have access to these things. We don't want you to have to pay a lot of money for it, but we want you as our listeners to have the resources so that you can do these studies yourselves. What we're doing with these podcasts, with their notes, is not that unique, and you can do it too. And that's what we want to see our listeners have the ability to do. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.